The wind howled across the barren landscape of Sirius-IV, a remote and desolate planet caught in the crossfire of a galactic war. Ethan tightened his scarf around his neck, shielding himself from the biting cold as he navigated the rocky terrain. His orders were clear: survey the area for any signs of enemy activity and return immediately. But Ethan had never been one to follow orders blindly, especially when his gut told him something wasn't right. As he climbed over a ridge, the faint smell of burning metal reached his nose. Peering down, he spotted a wrecked spacecraft half buried in the snow, its hull scorched and smoking. His instincts screamed at him to turn back. Investigating a crash site in enemy territory was asking for trouble. But then he heard it, a faint, high-pitched sound, almost like a cry. Ethan hesitated. Every survival instinct told him to leave, but curiosity and something deeper tugged at him. Against his better judgment, he slid down the slope toward the wreckage, his blaster drawn. The ship was small, clearly not a military vessel. Its design was sleek, almost elegant, with strange markings etched into the sides. The cry came again, louder this time, and Ethan's heart raced. He stepped cautiously through the torn metal and twisted debris, scanning for any sign of life. Then he saw her. Huddled in the corner of what might have been the cockpit was a small figure. Her pale blue skin was streaked with cuts and soot, and her white hair hung in tangled strands around her face. She couldn't have been more than 8 or 9 years old. Her large, luminous eyes locked onto Ethan's, filled with fear and desperation. Ethan froze, his mind racing. This was no ordinary child. She was clearly not human, and helping her could mean court-martial if his superiors found out. But as he looked at her trembling form, clutching a piece of fabric as if it could protect her, he couldn't bring himself to walk away. "It's okay," he said softly, lowering his weapon and holding out his hands to show he meant no harm. "I'm not going to hurt you." The girl didn't move. Her eyes darted between him and the jagged hole in the ship's hull, where the cold wind rushed in. Ethan took a cautious step closer, then another. He could see she was injured. Her leg was bent at an unnatural angle, and her breathing was shallow. "You're hurt," he said, his voice gentle. "Let me help you." The girl whimpered but didn't resist as Ethan crouched beside her. He pulled off his jacket and wrapped it around her small frame, shielding her from the cold. She was so light as he lifted her into his arms, and Ethan felt a pang of protectiveness he hadn't expected. The journey back to his camp was grueling. The girl clung to him tightly, her grip surprisingly strong for someone so frail. Ethan pushed through the icy winds, his boots crunching through the snow, his mind racing with questions. Who was she? How had she ended up here? And what would he do once he got her back to safety? As the dim lights of his hidden outpost came into view, Ethan glanced down at the girl. Her eyes were closed now, her breathing steadier, but her small body still shivered against his chest. He knew he was taking a huge risk bringing her here. If anyone found out, it could cost him everything. But as he looked at the fragile child in his arms, Ethan made a silent vow. No matter what, he would protect her. Ethan slipped quietly into his small, hidden outpost, the weight of the girl in his arms a constant reminder of the risk he was taking. The dim glow of a single lamp illuminated the cramped interior, filled with makeshift supplies and gear collected over years of living on the fringes. His heart pounded as he placed the girl gently on the cot in the corner. She stirred slightly, her pale blue skin standing out against the dull gray of the blanket he draped over her. Her white hair framed her delicate face, now peaceful despite the bruises and cuts. For a moment, Ethan allowed himself to feel relief. She was alive, and for now, safe. But the reality of the situation hit him hard. He wasn't supposed to bring anyone here, let alone a child from another species. If Command found out, they'd brand him a traitor. Yet, as he looked at her fragile form, he knew he couldn't turn back. Ethan grabbed a med kit and sat beside her, inspecting the injuries he'd noticed earlier. Her leg was badly twisted, likely broken, and there were shallow cuts across her arms. He worked carefully, setting the bone as gently as he could. She cried out in pain, her large eyes snapping open to stare at him with a mix of fear and confusion. "Easy," he said softly, his voice steady despite his racing heart. "I'm just trying to help." Her gaze lingered on him, wary but less hostile than before. Ethan couldn't understand her language, but the way her fingers gripped the edge of the blanket spoke volumes. She was afraid, but she was also trying to trust him. For the next few hours, Ethan tended to her injuries and gave her sips of water from his canteen. She didn't speak, but he noticed how her eyes followed his every move. It was as if she was trying to make sense of him, this stranger who had pulled her from the wreckage. As the night deepened, Ethan sat across the room, running a hand through his hair. He needed a plan. Keeping her here was dangerous, but leaving her out there was unthinkable. He thought of the traders who occasionally passed through the outer colonies, some of whom sympathized with refugees from the war. They might be her best chance. The girl shifted on the cot, her eyes meeting his again. Ethan couldn't help but smile faintly. "You've got some fight in you," he said. "That's good. You'll need it." She tilted her head slightly, as if trying to understand his words. Then, to his surprise, she reached out a small hand toward him. Ethan hesitated before taking it gently. Her skin was cold, but her grip was firm. In that moment, something passed between them, a silent acknowledgement of the trust they were building. Over the next few days, Ethan did his best to keep her hidden. He avoided using his communication systems to prevent any chance of being traced. Supplies were scarce, and he rationed everything to ensure she had enough to recover. The girl, though quiet, began to show small signs of recovery. She hobbled around the room on her good leg, her curiosity leading her to examine every tool and object in the outpost. Ethan caught her tinkering with an old scanner, her quick hands exploring the device's controls. "You're a smart one, aren't you?" he said with a grin. She didn't respond with words but gave him a faint smile, her first since he found her. Despite the small victories, Ethan knew time was running out. Patrols in the area were increasing, and he couldn't risk staying here much longer. One night, as the girl slept, he sat by the flickering lamp, studying a map of trade routes. "I'll get you somewhere safe," he whispered, glancing at her peaceful form. "Even if it means I can't stay." The early morning light seeped through the cracks in the outpost walls, casting long shadows across the room. Ethan leaned over the small map spread on the table, his eyes scanning the routes he had memorized countless times. He had decided on a plan. He would take the girl to a trading post 2 days away. It was risky, but it was her best shot at safety. Behind him, the girl stirred on the cot. Ethan turned to see her sitting up, her white hair falling over her face as she rubbed her eyes. She still didn't speak, but her expressions and actions were becoming more familiar to him. When she noticed him watching, she tilted her head curiously. "Good morning," he said, though he doubted she understood. He gestured toward the small plate of dried food he had set out for her. "Eat up. We've got a long trip ahead." She hesitated before reaching for the food. Her delicate fingers moved with precision as she nibbled on the rations, her eyes never leaving Ethan. He could see the question in her gaze, but he had no way to explain the danger they were in. He could only hope she trusted him enough to follow his lead. By midday, Ethan had packed what little they could carry. A compact survival kit, a few days' worth of rations, and a small energy weapon he hoped they wouldn't need. The girl watched as he strapped the pack onto his shoulders, her own small bag slung across her chest. When he knelt to her level, he pointed to the door. "We have to leave now," he said slowly, miming walking with his fingers. She seemed to understand, nodding silently. Ethan opened the door cautiously, scanning the snowy terrain for any signs of patrols. The coast was clear, for now. He gestured for the girl to follow, and together they stepped into the frigid air. The trek was grueling. The girl's injured legs slowed them down, but she was determined, rarely asking for help. Ethan admired her resilience, though he kept a close eye on her, ready to intervene if she faltered. The landscape around them was harsh and unforgiving, a mix of jagged rocks and endless snowfields that offered little shelter. As the hours passed, Ethan's nerves grew. He knew the risk of being spotted increased with every step they took. Enemy drones often patrolled the area, scanning for signs of unauthorized movement. Every sound, the crunch of snow underfoot, the distant howl of the wind, made his heart race. Late in the afternoon, the girl tugged on his sleeve, pointing to a formation of rocks ahead. Ethan nodded. It was a good place to rest and take cover. They huddled behind the stones, the cold seeping through their clothes despite their efforts to stay warm. Ethan handed the girl a small canteen of water. She accepted it gratefully, her hands trembling slightly from the chill. As she drank, he studied her face. There was a quiet determination there, far beyond her years. "You're stronger than most soldiers I've met," he said with a faint smile. She didn't understand his words, but the gentle tone seemed to comfort her. She gave him a small, shy smile in return. Their moment of peace was shattered by a distant hum. Ethan froze, his eyes narrowing as he scanned the horizon. A black speck appeared against the gray sky, growing larger as it approached. A drone. "Stay down," he whispered urgently, pulling the girl closer to the rocks. She obeyed without hesitation, her small body pressed against his side. Ethan held his breath as the drone hovered overhead, its sensors sweeping the area. The seconds felt like hours. Finally, the drone moved on, disappearing into the distance. Ethan exhaled slowly, his body relaxing slightly. He looked down at the girl, her wide eyes locked on his. "We're okay," he murmured, though he wasn't sure how much longer their luck would hold. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting the world in shadows, Ethan knew they couldn't afford another close call. They had to reach the trading post soon, or risk being caught before they ever had a chance to escape. The stars glittered faintly in the dark sky as Ethan and the girl pressed onward through the icy wilderness. The air grew colder with every passing hour, but the trading post was just beyond the next ridge, or so Ethan hoped. His breath misted in the frosty air as he glanced back at the girl, who trudged along silently. She was limping, her injured leg slowing her down, but her determination to keep moving was unshakable. "You're doing great," Ethan said softly, though he knew she couldn't understand him. He gave her an encouraging nod and gestured for her to rest briefly against a large boulder. She leaned on it, catching her breath while he scanned the horizon. The faint outline of the trading post comm tower appeared in the distance. Relief washed over Ethan. They were close, but close wasn't safe. Not yet. Patrols and rogue scavengers often roamed the area, and he couldn't afford to let his guard down. "Almost there," he said, pointing toward the faint structure. The girl followed his gesture and gave a slight nod, her large eyes shimmering with exhaustion, but also trust. They resumed their journey, each step crunching against the frozen ground. The silence of the wilderness was unnerving, broken only by the occasional gust of wind. Ethan's hand hovered near the small energy weapon strapped to his belt. Something about the stillness felt wrong. Suddenly, a low mechanical whirring sound pierced the quiet. Ethan froze, his senses on high alert. The girl stopped as well, clutching his sleeve tightly. His eyes darted around the landscape until he spotted the source. A patrol drone sweeping low across the terrain, its sensors glowing faintly as it scanned for movement. "Get down," Ethan whispered urgently, pulling the girl behind a jagged outcrop. They crouched low, the cold rock pressing against their backs as the drone drew closer. Ethan's heart pounded in his chest. The drone's movements were methodical, its sensors sweeping in wide arcs. He tightened his grip on the weapon at his side, ready to defend them if necessary. The girl pressed against him, her small fingers gripping his sleeve tightly. The drone hovered directly overhead, its sensors pausing momentarily on their hiding spot. Ethan held his breath, willing his body to remain still. His mind raced with contingency plans, each more desperate than the last. Then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, the drone shifted direction and moved away, its faint hum fading into the distance. Ethan exhaled shakily, the tension in his body slowly easing. That was too close, he muttered under his breath. He looked down at the girl, who was still clutching his sleeve. Her eyes were wide with fear, but she didn't cry or make a sound. Ethan gave her a reassuring smile. "You're brave, you know that." They waited a few more minutes before continuing their journey. The trading post loomed larger with every step, its weathered structure a beacon of hope against the desolate landscape. Ethan knew they couldn't celebrate yet. Reaching the post was only the first step. Convincing the traders to help her would be the real challenge. As they approached the outskirts of the post, Ethan motioned for the girl to stay close. The area was eerily quiet, but the faint glow of lights from the post suggested life inside. He led her carefully through the scattered debris of abandoned machinery and into the shadows of the outer buildings. Ethan tapped on the comm panel near the entrance, his breath fogging the small screen. Moments later, the door hissed open and a figure appeared, a rugged man with sharp eyes and a blaster slung over his shoulder. "You're late, Ethan," the man said, his voice low but familiar. His gaze shifted to the girl, and his expression hardened. "And what have you brought this time?" Ethan stepped forward protectively, his hand on the girl's shoulder. "I need your help, Jonas. She's not safe out there." Jonas studied the girl for a long moment before sighing. "Get inside before someone sees you." "But this is trouble, Ethan." Ethan guided the girl into the trading post, his resolve hardening. Trouble or not, he wasn't about to give up on her now. Inside the dimly lit trading post, the air was warmer but thick with tension. Jonas led Ethan and the girl through narrow corridors cluttered with crates and old machinery, stopping in a back room that served as both a workshop and a makeshift living space. The hum of an old generator filled the silence as Jonas turned to face them. "This is reckless, Ethan," Jonas said, his voice sharp. "You know the patrols have been tightening their grip around this sector. And now you show up with her." Ethan glanced at the girl, who stood close to him, her wide eyes scanning the room cautiously. She clutched the edge of his jacket, as if sensing the unease in Jonas's tone. Ethan stepped in front of her protectively. "She's just a kid, Jonas," Ethan replied firmly. "She lost everything in the crash. I couldn't leave her out there." Jonas crossed his arms, his gaze flicking between Ethan and the girl. "Do you have any idea what you've brought here? If the patrols catch wind of this, they won't just come for her. They'll raze this place to the ground." Ethan's jaw tightened. "I know the risks, but I didn't have a choice. I couldn't leave her to die." Jonas sighed heavily, rubbing the back of his neck. He walked over to a cluttered table and grabbed a mug of something steaming. "You always did have a knack for dragging trouble with you," he muttered. After a moment, he gestured to the girl. "What's her name?" Ethan hesitated. "I don't know. We can't talk. Not yet. But she understands enough. She's smart." The girl peeked out from behind Ethan, her gaze meeting Jonas'. There was no fear in her eyes now, only a quiet determination. Jonas studied her for a long moment before setting the mug down with a loud clink. "Fine," he said gruffly, "but only because you've never asked me for anything before. She can stay here, temporarily. I'll find someone who can take her farther, somewhere safe." Ethan felt a wave of relief, but didn't let it show. "Thank you, Jonas. You won't regret it." Jonas snorted. "I already do." As Jonas left the room, Ethan knelt beside the girl. She looked at him with a mixture of curiosity and trust, her small hands clutching the straps of her makeshift bag. "We're safe for now," he said softly, even though she couldn't understand his words. "But we have to be careful." She nodded slightly, as if sensing his meaning. Ethan reached into his pack and pulled out a small piece of dried fruit, offering it to her. She took it with a faint smile, her first sign of relaxation since they had entered the post. The next few hours passed in uneasy quiet. Jonas returned occasionally, muttering about trade routes and patrol schedules, but mostly left them alone. Ethan took the time to clean and rewrap the girl's injuries. She didn't flinch or complain, her resilience once again surprising him. As night fell, the hum of the generator softened, and the trading post seemed to settle into an uneasy calm. Ethan sat on an old crate, his weapon resting on his lap, while the girl curled up on a pile of blankets in the corner. He watched her as she slept, her breathing steady and her small frame finally at ease. For the first time in days, Ethan allowed himself to relax, but his mind raced with unanswered questions. Who was she? Where had she come from? And why did he feel such a fierce need to protect her? Jonas interrupted his thoughts, stepping into the room with a grim expression. "Ethan, we have a problem," he said, his voice low. "I picked up chatter on the comms. A patrol ship is sweeping this sector. They're looking for something, or someone." Ethan's grip on his weapon tightened. "How long do we have?" "Not long," Jonas replied. "If they come here, we're all in trouble." Ethan looked at the girl, then back at Jonas. "We'll figure it out," he said, determination hardening his voice. "We always do." The room was tense, the air thick with urgency as Ethan and Jonas stood across from each other. The faint hum of the generator seemed louder in the silence, punctuating the gravity of the situation. The girl, sensing the unease, sat quietly on the blankets, her wide eyes shifting between the two men. "How close are they?" Ethan asked, his voice low but firm. Jonas sighed, rubbing his temples. "Closer than I'd like. Their sweep pattern suggests they'll be near this sector by dawn. If they pick up any heat signatures or irregular activity, they'll investigate." Ethan glanced at the girl. She was too still, too quiet. She was trying to be brave, but he could see the fear flickering in her eyes. His chest tightened. He had to find a way to keep her safe, no matter what. "We need a plan," Ethan said, turning back to Jonas. "You said there are sympathetic traders. Can we contact them?" Jonas shook his head, not without drawing attention. "The comm lines are being monitored. If we send out a signal now, it's as good as painting a target on our backs." Ethan cursed under his breath and began pacing. His mind raced through their options, but every path seemed fraught with danger. Jonas was right. Using the comms would alert the patrols, and staying here was a gamble they couldn't afford. Finally, Jonas broke the silence. "There's one way," he said hesitantly, "but it's risky." Ethan stopped pacing. "I'm listening." Jonas leaned over the cluttered table and spread out a map. "There's an old smuggler's road about 5 kilometers east of here. It's a narrow canyon, shielded from most scans. If you can get through it, you'll reach a drop point where traders sometimes leave supplies. If they've been through recently, you might find transport logs or even someone willing to help." Ethan studied the map. The canyon was treacherous, its twists and turns a maze even without the patrols. But it was their best chance. "How do we know the patrols won't find us there?" Ethan asked. Jonas smirked faintly. "They're lazy. They'll stick to the main routes unless they have a reason to search deeper. Just don't give them one." Ethan nodded, already making calculations in his head. "We'll leave before first light." Jonas frowned. "You'll need supplies. I'll pack what I can spare, but you'll be on your own once you hit the canyon." "Understood," Ethan said. His voice was steady, but his mind was churning. He looked at the girl, who was watching him intently, her small frame curled up in the blankets. He crouched down beside her. "We're leaving soon," he said gently, pointing to the pack and then toward the door. She didn't reply, but her eyes softened with trust. She reached out and touched his hand briefly, a silent acknowledgement that she understood. The hours passed quickly as they prepared for the journey. Jonas handed Ethan a compact survival pack filled with food, water, and a few emergency tools. He also provided a small signal jammer, a device designed to scramble scans for a short period. "Use this only if you're cornered," Jonas warned. "It'll buy you a few minutes, but they'll know someone was there." Ethan nodded, slipping the device into his bag. "Thank you, Jonas, for everything." "Don't thank me yet," Jonas muttered. "Just get her out of here alive." Before the first rays of dawn broke the horizon, Ethan and the girl slipped out of the trading post. The cold air bit at their faces as they moved eastward, the barren landscape stretching endlessly before them. Ethan kept the girl close, his eyes scanning constantly for movement. As they reached the edge of the canyon, the terrain changed dramatically. Sheer cliffs loomed on either side, their jagged edges casting long shadows in the dim light. The narrow path ahead was uneven, littered with rocks and loose gravel. Ethan crouched and pointed down the path, whispering, "Stay close and follow me." The girl nodded, her small hand gripping his sleeve tightly. Together, they began their descent into the canyon. Each step a calculated risk. The silence was oppressive, broken only by the occasional sound of pebbles skittering down the cliffs. Halfway through the canyon, Ethan froze. A faint hum reached his ears, the unmistakable sound of a patrol drone. His heart raced as he pulled the girl into a crevice, pressing them both against the cold rock. The drone hovered above, its sensors sweeping the canyon. Ethan held his breath, his hand gripping the small signal jammer in his pocket. He prayed they wouldn't be detected. The seconds stretched into eternity before the drone moved on, its hum fading into the distance. Ethan exhaled slowly, his body tense but ready to move. "Let's go," he whispered, taking the girl's hand. They pressed forward, knowing the danger was far from over. The canyon grew narrower as Ethan and the girl pushed forward, the towering cliffs on either side casting deep shadows that swallowed the faint morning light. Every step they took was careful and deliberate, the rocky terrain unforgiving beneath their boots. The silence was eerie, broken only by the occasional distant rumble of shifting stones. Ethan kept glancing over his shoulder, his senses on high alert. The memory of the patrol drone still lingered in his mind. They couldn't afford another close call. His grip on the small energy weapon tightened as he guided the girl along the uneven path. "You're doing great," he whispered, offering her an encouraging smile. She nodded silently, her wide eyes scanning their surroundings with a mixture of curiosity and caution. She never strayed far from his side, her small hand occasionally brushing against his arm for reassurance. As they rounded a sharp bend, the path widened into a small clearing. Ethan paused, his instincts warning him to stay vigilant. The area felt too open, too exposed. He scanned the cliffs above, his eyes searching for any movement. Suddenly, a sharp metallic sound echoed through the canyon, a clank followed by a low whirring. Ethan's heart leaped into his throat. He pushed the girl behind a large boulder, gesturing for her to stay hidden. "Don't move," he whispered urgently, drawing his weapon. From the shadows, a group of figures emerged, 3 humanoids clad in mismatched armor, their faces obscured by helmets. Scavengers. They carried crude but dangerous weapons, and their movements were purposeful as they fanned out, clearly searching for something or someone. Ethan cursed under his breath. He had encountered scavengers before and knew they were ruthless. If they found him and the girl, they wouldn't hesitate to turn them in for a reward, or worse. The scavengers spoke in low tones, their voices muffled by their helmets. Ethan couldn't make out their words, but their body language suggested they were tracking something. One of them paused near the boulder where the girl was hiding, his head tilting as if he had heard something. Ethan acted quickly. He stepped out from behind the rocks, his weapon raised. "Looking for something," he called, his voice steady despite the adrenaline surging through him. The scavengers turned sharply, their weapons snapping up to aim at him. The leader, a burly figure with a scared helmet, stepped forward. "Just passing through," he said, his tone dripping with suspicion. "You seem a little out of place here, friend." Ethan shrugged, keeping his weapon trained on them. "Same could be said for you." The leader chuckled darkly. "This canyon isn't exactly a tourist spot. What's your story?" Ethan didn't answer. Instead, he subtly shifted his stance, putting himself between the scavengers and the girl's hiding spot. He needed to get them away before they noticed her. "I'd suggest you keep moving," Ethan said evenly. "There's nothing for you here." The leader tilted his head, clearly weighing his options. "Brave words for a lone man," he said. "But brave doesn't keep you alive." The tension crackled in the air, both sides ready to act at a moment's notice. Before things could escalate, a sudden rumble echoed through the canyon. Loose rocks tumbled down from the cliffs above, sending a cloud of dust into the air. The scavengers instinctively looked up, distracted. Ethan seized the opportunity. He fired a warning shot into the ground near their feet, the bright flash startling them. "Leave. Now," he commanded, his voice cold. The leader hesitated, then gestured for his companions to back off. "You're lucky we've got other priorities," he sneered. "But watch your back." As the scavengers retreated into the shadows, Ethan exhaled, his muscles finally relaxing. He turned back to the boulder, where the girl was peeking out cautiously. "It's okay," he said, kneeling beside her. "They're gone." She stepped out, her small face etched with worry, but also trust. She reached for his hand, and he took it, giving her a reassuring squeeze. "We need to keep moving," Ethan said, his voice steady. "We're almost there." The girl nodded, and together they continued down the canyon, the sense of danger lingering in the air. Ethan knew they weren't out of the woods yet, but he was determined to see her to safety, no matter the cost. The canyon walls gradually began to widen, revealing the faint outlines of the smugglers' drop point ahead. The path had become more treacherous, littered with jagged rocks and loose gravel. Ethan's boots slipped occasionally, but he pressed on, holding the girl's hand to steady her. The soft glow of the horizon hinted that dawn was near, and they had to reach the drop point before the patrols caught up. "You're doing great," Ethan said quietly, glancing at the girl. She looked up at him with tired eyes, but gave a small nod, her determination shining through the exhaustion. As they approached the drop point, Ethan noticed the remnants of old crates and scattered supplies half buried in the dirt. The place looked deserted, but it carried the faint signs of recent activity. He scanned the area cautiously, his hand resting on the weapon at his hip. "Stay here," he whispered, motioning for the girl to hide behind a boulder. She obeyed without hesitation, crouching low as she watched him from the shadows. Ethan moved toward the center of the clearing, his eyes scanning every detail. He found a small metallic crate wedged between two rocks. Pulling it free, he opened it carefully, revealing a stash of supplies and a data pad with a blinking light. Relief washed over him. The data pad likely contained logs or coordinates for the next smuggler rendezvous. Before he could examine it further, a sharp sound echoed through the canyon, a distant hum, growing louder. His stomach dropped. Patrol drones. He grabbed the data pad and shoved it into his pack, then sprinted back to the girl. "Move. Now," he hissed, pulling her to her feet. The hum grew louder, accompanied by the faint but distinct sound of approaching engines. Ethan's mind raced. The patrol wasn't just searching aimlessly, they were heading straight for the drop point. Somehow, they had been tracked. He guided the girl toward a narrow crevice in the canyon wall, barely wide enough for them to squeeze through. "In here," he said urgently, helping her through first before following. The space was cramped and dark, but it offered cover from the open clearing. The patrol ship descended, its bright searchlights sweeping the area. The harsh beams illuminated the clearing, highlighting the abandoned supplies and footprints Ethan had left behind. He cursed under his breath, his heart pounding as he pressed himself against the cold rock. The girl clung to his arm, her small fingers digging into his sleeve. He could feel her trembling, and he whispered softly, "It's okay. Stay quiet. They won't find us." The patrol ship hovered for what felt like an eternity, its sensors scanning every inch of the area. Ethan gripped the small signal jammer in his pocket, ready to activate it if the patrol got too close. But he knew it was a gamble. Using the jammer would reveal their position as soon as its effects wore off. Finally, the ship began to move, its engines roaring as it ascended. Ethan held his breath until the sound faded completely, leaving the canyon in silence once more. He exhaled slowly, his body still tense. "We're safe," he said, though his voice was more for the girl than himself. She looked up at him, her wide eyes filled with relief and trust. Ethan guided her out of the crevice and back onto the path. "We need to keep moving," he said. "We're close now, just a little farther." The girl nodded, her steps steadier despite the lingering fear. Ethan led her down the winding path, his eyes constantly scanning the horizon. Every sound, every shadow seemed like a threat, but he pushed forward. As they rounded the final bend, the canyon opened up to reveal a wide plateau bathed in the soft glow of dawn. In the distance, a small freighter sat parked near the edge of the plateau. A figure stood beside it, waving. Relief flooded Ethan's chest. "We made it," he said, glancing at the girl. Her lips curved into a faint smile, the first he had seen since they began their journey. But even as they approached the freighter, Ethan's instincts remained sharp. He knew they weren't safe yet. The patrols were still out there, and the final step of their journey would test every ounce of his resolve. Ethan tightened his grip on the girl's hand as they approached the freighter on the plateau. The figure standing near the ship was a wiry man with a weathered face and sharp eyes, his jacket patched with signs of years spent on the fringes of the galaxy. He waved them closer, his expression cautious but not hostile. "You're cutting it close," the man said, his voice gravelly. "Patrols have been all over this area. What are you running from?" Ethan didn't waste time with explanations. "We need passage, off-world, as far away from here as you can take us. No questions, no trail." The man studied them both, his gaze lingering on the girl. Her pale blue skin and white hair immediately marked her as different, and Ethan could see the flicker of concern in the man's eyes. "She's the reason, isn't she?" the man said, gesturing toward the girl. "You know the price on her kind." Ethan stepped in front of her, his voice firm. "I'm not here to negotiate her worth. I'm here to make sure she's safe." The man scratched his chin, then sighed. "You've got guts, I'll give you that. Get on board. We'll talk payment later." Ethan led the girl up the freighter's ramp, relief mingling with unease. The cargo bay was dimly lit and filled with crates of supplies, but it felt like a sanctuary compared to the dangers they had faced in the canyon. The girl clung to his side, her eyes darting around the unfamiliar space. "Stay here," Ethan said gently, guiding her to sit on a crate. "I'll make sure this is legit." She nodded, her small hands clutching her bag tightly. Ethan gave her a reassuring smile before heading toward the cockpit, where the pilot was already preparing for liftoff. "Destination?" the man asked, flipping switches and adjusting controls. "Neutral space," Ethan replied. "Somewhere quiet, off the radar." The pilot nodded. "You're lucky. I've got a supply run scheduled near the drift sector. It's as quiet as it gets out there." The engines roared to life, and the freighter lifted off the ground, the plateau shrinking beneath them. Ethan felt the tension in his chest ease slightly as the horizon disappeared, replaced by the vast expanse of stars. For the first time in days, they were moving away from danger. He returned to the cargo bay, where the girl sat watching the stars through a small window. She turned to him as he approached, her expression soft but questioning. Ethan sat beside her, his voice calm. "We're safe now," he said, though he knew she couldn't understand his words. "You'll have a chance to start over." The girl tilted her head, then reached into her bag and pulled out a small object, a metal pendant, simple but intricately engraved. She held it out to him, her eyes shining with gratitude. "For me?" Ethan asked, surprised. She nodded, pressing it into his hand. The weight of the gesture wasn't lost on him. It wasn't just a gift. It was her way of saying thank you, of acknowledging the bond they had formed. Ethan closed his hand around the pendant, his throat tightening. "I'll keep it safe," he promised. The freighter slipped into hyperspace, the stars outside stretching into streaks of light. Ethan leaned back against the wall, exhaustion finally catching up with him. The girl curled up beside him, her head resting against his arm. For the first time, Ethan allowed himself to imagine a future, not just for her, but for both of them. He had no idea what challenges lay ahead, but one thing was certain: he wasn't going to leave her side. As the freighter sailed through the endless void, a sense of hope settled over them. They had escaped the dangers of the canyon, the patrols, and the scavengers. Now they had a chance to build something new, a life where trust, courage, and kindness were the only things that mattered.